Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, is there a sealed letter somewhere in your house? A paper you have never quite dared to open? Watson once learned that a locked room guards its secret poorly, for truth has a way of slipping through the smallest gap. Do subscribe so no sealed door remains closed to you. Now, settle in, for as Holmes believed, a name built on silence is no name at all. Find us too on Watson's Margins, Spotify. Link below. The House of Harbury Mere. There are houses, I have observed in the course of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, which seem to carry the temperament of their inhabitants stamped upon every stone and casement, so that a stranger walking up the avenue for the first time might read something of the family history before ever the door was opened to him. Harbury Mere was such a house. It stood some 4 miles from the nearest station, upon a low rise of ground overlooking a stretch of grey water, from which, I was told, it took its name, and its grey gables and mullioned windows possessed a severity that seemed less the product of architecture than of character. I had occasion to visit it in the autumn of that year, in circumstances which I shall presently relate, and even before I had learned the particulars of the trouble that had befallen its inhabitants, I confess that the place struck me as one governed less by affection than by duty. The portraits in the long gallery looked down upon the visitor not with welcome but with a kind of ancestral scrutiny, as though each vane in turn were satisfying himself that the newcomer was worthy of the threshold he crossed. The cabinets were locked. The clocks, I noticed, kept a scrupulous and almost military time. It was a house, in short, that had long ago exchanged warmth for order, and had, I think, ceased to notice the bargain it had made. The family of Vane had held Harbury Mere for some 6 generations, and the late baronet Sir Edric Vane had died some months before the events of which I write, leaving behind him an estate of no great magnitude but of considerable delicacy, for it was bound about with old settlements, old promises, and older silences. The management of that estate had fallen, in the natural course of things, to Mr. Abel Straker, the family solicitor, a dry and exacting man who had served 3 generations of Vanes with a fidelity that inspired more respect than affection. It was Straker who held the keys, Straker who knew which claims upon the estate were lawful, and which were merely convenient, and it was Straker, I need hardly say, who was to prove the pivot upon which the whole curious business turned. The present mistress of the house was Lady Honoria Vane, the baronet's widow, a woman of perhaps 50 years whose bearing suggested iron rather than grief. I had not yet met her when this narrative opens, but I had heard something of her from my old friend Captain Miles Hatherley, whose acquaintance I had first made in Afghanistan, and who was now, by a circumstance he modestly described as good fortune, engaged to be married to a young relation of the house, a Miss Clara Vane. It was from Hatherley that the first intimation of trouble reached me, though I did not at the time perceive its true importance. He wrote to me in some agitation, asking whether I might spare him an evening, for he found himself, as he put it, in a position where he could neither act nor remain silent with an easy conscience. I confess that I thought little of it beyond the ordinary anxieties of a man about to be married into a family not his own, and it was only later, when I laid the letter before Holmes, that I understood how near the truth his instinct had carried him, for the household at Harbury Mere was, upon closer acquaintance, a curious gathering of interests, each pulling in its own quiet direction beneath the surface of a common morning. There was Reginald Vane, the late baronet's nephew and heir presumptive, a young man of good humour but poor discipline, whose expectations, I gathered, considerably exceeded his patience. There was Miss Clara Vane herself, a poor relation whose position in the household rested upon some provision of her uncle's, that had never, so far as I could learn, been made entirely public. There was Mrs. Elspeth Rowan, the housekeeper, a woman of long service and longer silences, who watched the family with the particular devotion of a servant who has outlived her usefulness and knows it. There was Mr. Percival Lyle, a young clerk in Straker's employ, meek in manner but, as I was afterward to learn, considerably more observant than his manner suggested. And there was the Reverend Atherton, the family chaplain, a gentleman whose concern for propriety struck me, even upon first acquaintance, as somewhat disproportionate to his office. Each of these persons, I would come to understand, desired something different from the settlement of Sir Edric's estate. Money, or marriage, or legitimacy, or silence, or simple peace. And it was the singular achievement of my friend Holmes that he was able, from among so many private and conflicting wishes, to draw out the one thread that mattered. But I anticipate. At the time of which I write, I knew only that Hatherley was troubled, that the estate of Harbury Mere was approaching its formal settlement, and that a document of some importance, the executor's bond, guaranteeing the lawful administration of the estate, was shortly to be produced from the sealed muniment room where it had lain, under Straker's own seal, in perfect security. It did not remain there long. I did not know, as I folded Hatherley's letter and laid it upon my desk that evening, that within the week I should be standing beside Sherlock Holmes upon the gravel sweep before Harbury Mere, looking up at those grey gables with an interest very different from the idle curiosity of a visitor, and that the house, for all its air of ancient and settled order, was about to yield up a secret that its inhabitants had spent 20 years in burying. Chapter 2. The Executor's Dinner. "You will observe, Watson," said Holmes, without looking up from the letter I had just placed before him, "that your friend Hatherley is a man accustomed to plain dealing, and finds himself, for perhaps the first time in his military career, quite at a loss as to how a gentleman ought to behave when he suspects an injustice he cannot name. I confess that I had read the letter in much the same light, though I had not thought to express it so precisely." Holmes turned the sheet toward the lamp, studied the hand for a moment longer than its contents seemed to warrant, and laid it down upon the arm of his chair. He writes hurriedly, and yet the letters are formed with unusual care, the writing of a man who has begun the letter 3 times before committing himself to a 4th attempt. He fears that Miss Vane will be disinherited by what he calls a technicality, and yet he cannot explain the nature of that technicality without, in his own words, betraying a confidence. That is interesting, Watson. A man does not guard so carefully a confidence that concerns mere money. I own that I had thought nothing of the sort, having read the letter chiefly as the natural anxiety of a soldier about to take a bride whose prospects were not entirely settled. But before Holmes could pursue the matter further, or before I could press him upon it, there came a ring at the bell, and a telegram was brought up which changed the complexion of the whole affair. Holmes read it twice and passed it to me without comment. It ran thus: "Come at once. Harbury. Mere executor's bond missing from sealed room situation. Most grave Hatherley." "Well, Watson," said Holmes, rising and reaching for his pipe with a particular briskness that told me his interest was thoroughly engaged, "it appears that your friend's technicality has resolved itself into something a good deal more concrete. A document does not vanish from a sealed room by accident, and a family does not summon a stranger to look into such a vanishing, unless the local machinery of the law has already proved insufficient to their purpose, or unless they distrust that machinery for reasons of their own. I think we should go down this evening, if a train can be found." A train was found, and by the following afternoon we stood upon the gravel sweep before Harbury Mere, where I had occasion to observe, before ever the door was opened to us, that Holmes had already formed some opinion of the household from the manner of its receiving us. A footman came out to take our bags with a haste that seemed less courtesy than nervousness, and behind him, in the doorway, I caught a glimpse of faces at the long windows of the drawing-room, faces that withdrew the instant they perceived themselves observed. "They have been watching for us this half-hour, unless I am mistaken," Holmes murmured, "and yet no one comes forward to greet us. That is curious, Watson. A household in genuine distress does not stand upon ceremony." We were received at length by Lady Honoria Vane herself, a tall and rigidly composed woman whose grief, if grief it was, expressed itself in a stillness so complete as to seem almost deliberate. She thanked us for coming with the correct number of correct words and no more, and it was left to Captain Hatherley, who met us in the hall a moment later with an eagerness he could not disguise, to give us the particulars of what had occurred. It appeared that a dinner had been held the previous evening, in advance of the formal reading and certification of Sir Edric's estate, at which Mr. Abel Straker had announced before the assembled family that all was in perfect order, and that the executor's bond, the instrument upon which the lawful administration of the estate depended, would be produced the following morning from the muniment room, where it had been placed under his own seal. It was a curious dinner, Doctor, Hatherley told me, drawing me aside while Holmes conversed with Lady Honoria. I have dined at a good many tables in my time, and I have never sat at one where so much was said and so little meant. Straker spoke as though he were pronouncing sentence rather than announcing good news. Reginald was sullen. Clara scarcely touched her plate, and old Atherton said grace as though he expected the roof to fall in before he had finished it. I might have set this down to a young man's natural anxiety, but when Holmes rejoined us I found that he had drawn much the same conclusion from a very different quarter. "I have been observing our hostess, Watson," he said quietly, as we were shown to our rooms to dress for dinner, "and I confess she puzzles me. A woman who has lost, by what appears to be theft, a document essential to the security of her late husband's estate, ought by rights to be either indignant or afraid. Indignant if she suspects a servant or a stranger, afraid if she suspects one of her own blood. Lady Honoria is neither. She is watchful. She watches the door, Watson, not as one who fears an intruder, but as one who fears a particular person's arrival." That evening, at a dinner considerably more subdued than the one which had preceded the loss, I had the opportunity of observing the household for myself, and I own that Hatherley's account had not exaggerated their strangeness. Reginald Vane ate little, and drank a great deal, and spoke, when he spoke at all, with the loud carelessness of a man determined to appear unconcerned. Miss Clara Vane sat very upright and very pale, and twice I saw her glance toward Lady Honoria with an expression that was not resentment, as I had been led to expect, but something nearer to pity. The housekeeper, Mrs. Rowan, moved about the table with a silent efficiency, and I noticed, though I confess I thought little of it at the time, that her eyes rested oftener upon Mr. Straker than upon the safe that had been robbed. It was Holmes, of course, who summed up the matter as we withdrew that night, standing for a moment at the window of our room, from which the black bulk of the muniment room's roof was just visible against the stars. "They do not behave, Watson, like people who have been robbed," said he. "They behave like actors who have rehearsed a scene, and are now waiting with considerable anxiety to see which player will forget his lines." I asked him what he meant by it, but he would say no more that night, save that we should do well to examine the sealed room before the household had time to compose itself further, and with that observation, cryptic as it was, I was obliged to content myself until the morning. Chapter 3. The Vanishing from the Sealed Room. The muniment room at Harbury Mere was reached by a single narrow passage from the library, and I have seldom examined a chamber so admirably suited by its very construction to defeat the ordinary methods of theft. It possessed one door, of ancient oak reinforced with iron, one window set high in the outer wall, and fitted with a stout lattice, and against the inner wall an iron safe of considerable age, in which the family papers had reposed, I was given to understand, for the better part of a century. Inspector Forester of the County Constabulary, a solid and not unintelligent man whose manner suggested more confidence than his conclusions altogether warranted, received us at the door with the air of one who has already solved his case, and is prepared, out of courtesy, to permit others to examine his workings. "You'll find it exactly as it was discovered, Mr. Holmes," said he. "Seal unbroken, door locked, safe closed, and yet the dispatch case within is as empty as my hat. I don't mind telling you it's a rare puzzle, though I fancy I've laid my hand upon the answer." Holmes murmured something civil and knelt at once before the door, where the remains of the wax seal yet adhered to the join between door and frame, I watched him examine it through his lens for the better part of a minute, turning his head this way and that as though the wax might yield up its testimony more readily from one angle than another. "The seal is genuine," he said at length, rising. "That much I will grant the inspector without argument. Sir Straker's own signet, and pressed, I should say, by his own hand. The impression is clean and even, save at the lower edge, where it has been very slightly flattened, as though some object had rested against it, or some second pressure had been applied after the wax had begun to set." "A servant's carelessness, perhaps," suggested Forrester. "Perhaps," said Holmes, in a tone that conveyed no great conviction, and passed on into the room itself. Mr. Straker was present to receive us, a spare and precise old gentleman whose manner, I thought, betrayed less distress at the loss of the document than irritation at the disorder it had introduced into his affairs. He explained, in the dry manner of a man reciting evidence he has already rehearsed for the police, that he had placed the executor's bond, together with certain other papers, in a leather dispatch case, that he had locked the case within the safe with his own hand, and that he had then sealed the door of the room before retiring, in strict accordance with the custom he had observed at Harbury Mere for 30 years. "And you are certain, Mr. Straker," said Holmes, "that the dispatch case was never for a moment out of your sight between the time the bond was placed in it and the time you locked it away?" There was the smallest hesitation before the solicitor answered, so brief that I might have missed it had I not been watching him closely at Holmes's own suggestion. "I stepped out for perhaps 10 minutes before dinner," he admitted, "to speak with the housekeeper regarding an alteration in the evening's arrangements. The case remained upon the table in this room. I do not think it material." "You did not think it material," Holmes repeated without emphasis, and turned his attention to the safe. The combination, we were given to understand, was known to 3 persons only: Straker himself, Lady Honoria, and the young clerk Lyle, who had been entrusted with it in the ordinary course of his duties. The safe showed no sign of forcing. Its mechanism, when Holmes tested it, answered smoothly and without resistance to Straker's hand. It was while the inspector was expounding, with some satisfaction, his theory of the case, that Reginald Vane, who had been heard quarrelling bitterly with Straker over the settlement 2 days before, had somehow contrived to possess himself of the bond before the sealing of the room, that I observed Holmes's attention wander from the safe to the high window above it. He drew a chair beneath it, mounted upon the seat, with the agility that always surprised me in a man of his sedentary habits, and examined the sill and the lattice with the closest attention. I saw him draw his finger along the inner edge of the stone and hold it up for a moment to the light. "There is soot here," he observed, "upon a sill some 14 feet from the nearest chimney, in a room where, I am assured, no fire has been lit these 3 days. That is a small thing, Inspector, but small things have a way of growing large in the telling." Forrester allowed that it was odd, but pointed out, not unreasonably, that the lattice itself was fast, and had shown no sign of having been opened. "I have not said it was open last night," Holmes replied, descending from his chair. "I have said only that soot does not travel 14 feet upon its own initiative." It was while we stood thus that I had occasion to observe the household as they came and went about the library beyond, drawn, I suppose, by curiosity they could not altogether suppress. Reginald Vane stood apart, his anger open and unconcealed, demanding loudly that the police be given a free hand to search wherever they pleased. Miss Clara, by contrast, hovered near the door with an expression that struck me as considerably nearer to fear than to relief, though relief, on the theory that the bond's loss might delay some unwelcome settlement, was surely the emotion one might have expected of her. Lady Honoria remained pale and composed, a stillness which I had begun, under Holmes's influence, to find less admirable than suspicious. Mrs. Rowan, the housekeeper, stood a little behind her mistress, her eyes moving not to the safe, nor to the window Holmes had just quitted, but to Mr. Straker himself, with an intensity she seemed at pains to conceal. And young Lyle, the clerk, lingered at the passage's end with the particular unhappiness of a man who possesses knowledge he has not been asked, and does not wish to be asked to share. "You will have observed, Watson," said Holmes to me quietly, as we withdrew at last from the muniment room, "that the household breakfast this morning was served a full 3/4 of an hour later than its custom, though no explanation has been offered for the change. I confess I find that circumstance a good deal more suggestive than the inspector's scrap of torn paper. We are not looking, I think, for a thief in the ordinary sense of the word. We are looking for someone who required a little more time than the household's routine allowed them, and who altered that routine very quietly to obtain it." Chapter 4. The First False Assumption. It has been my custom, in setting down these narratives, to record events very nearly in the order in which they reached me, trusting that the reader, no less than myself at the time, will find some value in following Holmes's reasoning through its false turnings as well as its true ones. I set down, therefore, without apology, the theory which very nearly closed the case upon that second morning at Harbury Mere, though it was, as events proved, no theory at all, but a mere shadow cast by guilt of quite another kind. Holmes spent the better part of the morning in reconstructing, with the household's grudging assistance, the exact movements of the previous evening. Dinner, we were told, had been served at 8, as was the invariable custom of the house. Prayers had followed at 10, and the doors had been locked, according to old Mr. Straker's own testimony, at 11 precisely. It was a routine, Lady Honoria assured us, that had not varied in 20 years. "And yet," said Holmes when we had withdrawn to the small morning room that had been placed at our disposal, "the servant's own account does not agree with the mistress's. The tea, Watson, was delayed by some 20 minutes according to the under-housemaid, who complains of it still, for it disarranged her evening entirely. The lamps in the library were trimmed a full half-hour later than usual, and Mrs. Rowan explains both circumstances by a single cause, a chimney that smoked. A natural enough excuse, I observed. Natural enough were the weather less still. I made a point of inquiring, and I am assured by the gardener, who is a more reliable witness upon such matters than any person indoors, that scarcely a breath of wind stirred the whole evening. A flue does not choose, of its own accord, to misbehave upon a still night after drawing cleanly for a fortnight before it. I confess I saw little in this beyond the ordinary confusion of a household under strain, and I was not alone in my scepticism, for Inspector Forrester, entering at that moment with an air of suppressed triumph, plainly regarded the whole inquiry into lamps and chimneys as so much wasted labour. "I think you may spare yourself further trouble over the servant's tea, Mr. Holmes," said he, "for I have found something a good deal more to the purpose." And he laid upon the table a scrap of paper torn raggedly across, upon which a single word or the greater part of one could be plainly read, the letters B-O-N, followed by a tear that had carried away the rest. "It was found in Mr. Reginald Vane's room," Forrester continued, "thrust down behind the drawer of his writing-table, where a man might hide a thing in haste and trust that no one would think to look. I have questioned him upon it, and he does not deny that he was in the library after dinner, though he claims he went there only to have words with Mr. Straker regarding his own prospects. I own that this discovery, coming upon the heels of what I already knew of Reginald's temper and his debts, struck me as very nearly conclusive, and I said as much to Holmes when we were again alone. "You're in good company, Watson," he replied, "for the inspector shares your view entirely, and I confess the evidence, taken by itself, points in no other direction. And yet I find myself troubled by a very simple question, which the inspector has not thought to ask. If Reginald Vane took the bond for gain, to force some better settlement upon his aunt, let us say, or to delay a certification that threatened his own inheritance, why is he, of all the household, the loudest in demanding that the police be given a free hand? A guilty man does not clamour for a thorough search of his own house. He may be bold enough to brazen it out. He may, but boldness of that kind is a rare quality, Watson, and rarer still in a man whose hands, I observed at breakfast, are not quite steady, and whose eyes do not once meet his aunt's across the table. No, Reginald's anger is genuine, I think, But it is not the anger of a thief who's been found out. It is the anger of a man who feels himself accused unjustly and cannot understand why the true culprit does not come forward to clear him. He rose and paced the length of the small room, his hands clasped behind him in the attitude I had come to know so well. There is a second circumstance, Watson, which weighs with me more heavily than any scrap of torn paper. You will recall the key to the muniment room, which the inspector found this morning restored to its accustomed place upon the board in Mr. Straker's study, precisely where it is kept when not in use. I recall it. I examined that board with some care before the key was disturbed by careless hands, and I observed that the dust beneath it, for the board is dusted, it appears, but rarely, and the housemaid's negligence, as this once served us admirably, had been disturbed in a shape somewhat larger and more rectangular than the key itself, as though some other object, flat and of a certain size, had rested there beside it and had since been removed. I asked him what object he supposed it to have been, but he would not be drawn. I have a suspicion, but a suspicion is a poor foundation upon which to build an accusation, and I have been wrong before, Watson, though I do not care to dwell upon the occasions. I will say only this, that the sealed room, ingenious as its riddle appears, is not, I think, the true mystery of Harbury Mere. Doors and windows and wax seals can be examined and, given patience, understood. What I cannot yet account for is the deeper puzzle, which is this. Why does this household, having suffered what it describes as a grievous theft, appear united in a single silent purpose, not to see the thief discovered, but to see the inquiry halted at some particular and, as yet, invisible line? He said no more upon the subject that morning, but I noticed as we went down to luncheon that his eyes rested longest not upon Reginald Vane, whom the inspector was already disposed to charge, but upon Lady Honoria, who sat very upright at the head of the table, and upon the housekeeper who stood, as ever, a little behind her chair. Chapter 5. Holmes questions the household. "I do not propose to accuse anyone this afternoon, Watson," said Holmes, as we crossed the hall toward the small study that had been given over to his use, "and I should be obliged if you would make that plain to each of them, should the opportunity arise. A witness who feels himself accused will guard his tongue. A witness who feels himself merely consulted will very often say a great deal more than he intends." It was in this spirit, then, that Holmes conducted, over the course of that long afternoon, a series of interviews which I set down here not in their exact order, but grouped, for the reader's convenience, according to the light they severally threw upon the darkness of the case. Reginald Vane came first, and came defiantly, seating himself without invitation, and regarding Holmes with the particular truculence of a young man who suspects, not without reason, that he is the object of general suspicion. "I'll tell you plainly what I told the inspector," said he. "I am in debt. I don't deny it, and I dare say half the county knows it before I do. I went to Straker after dinner to ask whether the settlement could not be arranged to allow me some present relief. He refused me, as he has refused me before, and I said things I should not have said, and there's an end of it. I never touched his infernal bond, and I'll take my oath on it. You wished for money, then, and not for delay. What use is delay to me? I want the thing settled, Mr. Holmes, not thrown into further confusion. A man in debt does not thank his creditors for patience." I thought this fairly reasoned, and Holmes, I observed, let the young man go with no more than a few questions as to the exact hour of his interview with Straker, questions which Reginald answered readily enough, and which seemed to satisfy Holmes upon some point he did not trouble to explain. Miss Clara Vane came next, and it was in this interview, I think, that I first began to perceive the true shape of the trouble that lay beneath the theft of the bond. "You are afraid, Miss Vane," Holmes said gently, when the ordinary questions had been asked and answered, "and I think your fear is not for yourself alone. Will you not tell me why?" She hesitated a long moment before replying, and when she spoke it was in a voice scarcely above a whisper. "My uncle promised me, before he died, that I should be provided for, Not merely as a poor relation is provided for, Mr. Holmes, but properly as one who had some real claim upon his affection. He never said before witnesses what the ground of that claim might be, and now that the bond is lost, I fear the whole settlement will be delayed, or worse, thrown open to question in a manner that can bring nothing but pain to people I love, whatever the outcome. You fear exposure, then, rather than loss. She did not answer this directly, but her silence, I thought, was answer enough, and Holmes did not press her further. Captain Hatherley, when his turn came, spoke with the bluntness of a soldier unaccustomed to concealment. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Holmes, since honesty seems in short supply at Harbury Mere just now. I want Clara's position made clear before we marry, not because I doubt her worth, for I'd marry her tomorrow on a beggar's portion if the choice were mine alone. But my family will not receive a bride whose standing in this house cannot be plainly stated, and I'll not have her shamed at my own table for want of a paper that ought to have settled the matter months ago." Young Lyle, the clerk, proved a more difficult subject, for he answered every question with the anxious brevity of a man who fears to say either too little or too much. Mr. Straker instructed me to copy certain abstracts of the estate for the certification he admitted at last when Holmes had drawn him out by patient degrees, but not others. I did as I was told, Mr. Holmes. I am only a clerk. And yet it troubles you, Holmes observed, that you were told to copy some and not others. The young man's colour rose, and he said nothing, which told me, as it plainly told Holmes, a great deal more than words could have done. Mrs. Rowan, the housekeeper, was the last and, in her own way, the most obstinate of our witnesses. She answered every question touching the household's routine with perfect readiness. But when Holmes inquired, almost carelessly, after a lady's maid who had left the family service some 20 years before, her manner altered so completely that I set down my pen, which I had been idly employing to note the substance of the interviews, and watched her with fresh attention. "I do not see, sir, what a servant gone these 20 years can have to do with a bond lost last Tuesday," said she. And though her voice remained perfectly level, her hands, I observed, had gone quite still upon her apron, in the manner of a person who dares not permit them to tremble. "Perhaps nothing whatever," Holmes replied mildly. "I ask from curiosity only, Mrs. Rowan, and you are, of course, at liberty to decline an answer." But he didn't press her, and she withdrew with the visible relief of a woman who has been let off more lightly than she expected. When the last of them had gone, Holmes sat for some time in silence, his fingertips together, his eyes half closed. "You perceive the pattern now, Watson, I hope, though I confess it took me the better part of the afternoon to see it whole. Reginald fears poverty, and says so openly. Hatherley fears his family's disapproval, and says so with a soldier's frankness. But Clara, and Lyle, and Mrs. Rowan, and Lady Honoria most of all, fear something they will not name at all, and a fear that dares not speak its own name is very often the truest fear of the lot. We are not dealing with simple greed, Watson. We are dealing with disgrace, or with the terror of it, which very often serves quite as well." Chapter 6. The Agreement No One Speaks of. Holmes spent the whole of the following morning, not in further examination of the muniment room, which he now professed to regard as a puzzle already half solved, but in the estate office, where old ledgers and parish registers had been placed at his disposal through the somewhat reluctant courtesy of Mr. Straker. I found him there at noon, seated amid a small mountain of dusty volumes, a magnifying lens in one hand, and an expression upon his face that I had learned, over years of friendship, to associate with genuine discovery rather than mere industry. "Come in, Watson, and close the door," said he without looking up. "I've been reading the history of the Vane family in its account books, which is generally a more truthful record than any that appears upon a tombstone. You will be interested to learn that some 20 years ago, a young woman entered service at Harbury Mere under the style of Miss Ellen Marsh, and left it again, rather suddenly, some 18 months later, with a settlement of £40 entered against her name in Sir Edric's own hand, a sum considerably in excess of anything a departing lady's maid might ordinarily expect. You believe this connected with Clara?" I believe a great many things, Watson, but I prefer, where I may, to found my belief upon fact rather than sentiment. Observe this entry." He turned the ledger toward me, and I saw, in a column headed only with initials, a small recurring payment, quarterly, continuing without interruption for some 17 years, and terminating only with an entry recording in the plainest terms the enrolment of 1 C.V. at a school in Hampshire. Clara Vane! So I believe. And observe further that the payments cease altogether in the year Sir Edric brought her openly into his household as a poor relation, as though a private arrangement had been converted at that point into a public one, though not, I think, so public as the truth itself would have required. We were interrupted at this juncture by the entrance of the Reverend Atherton, who had plainly been informed of Holmes's occupation, and who came in with the air of a man who has rehearsed his objections upon the way. "I understand, Mr. Holmes, that you have been examining matters which lie some way outside the province of a lost document," said he, seating himself uninvited. "I would ask you, as a Christian, and as a friend of this family, to consider whether some truths are not better left buried, where they can do no further harm to the living." "That depends, Reverend, upon whether the truth in question is indeed buried, or merely covered over," Holmes replied. "A buried thing decays quietly and troubles no one. A thing that is merely covered has a way of working its way to the surface, generally at the moment least convenient to those who covered it." "You speak in riddles, sir." "I speak of old sins, Reverend Atherton, which I understand to be very much your province rather than mine. I ask you plainly, was Sir Edric Vane the father of Miss Clara Vane?" The chaplain's face went through several changes before settling into an expression of pained resignation. "I administered no sacrament that would oblige me to answer that question, Mr. Holmes, and I will not answer it now, save to say that whatever passed between Sir Edric and heaven upon the matter is not, I think, yours to unearth for the satisfaction of a county newspaper. I have no interest in newspapers, Reverend, and considerably less in scandal for its own sake. I have an interest only in recovering a document unlawfully removed from a sealed room, and in understanding why so many persons of evident good conscience appear united in wishing that recovery to proceed no further than the door of this office." Atherton had no answer to this, and withdrew shortly afterward with a dignity that could not quite conceal his discomfort. "You perceive it now, Watson, I think." "Entire," said Holmes when the door had closed. "We have, upon the one hand, Lady Honoria, whose composure I have come to read not as innocence but as the discipline of a woman guarding a single fixed purpose. We have Reverend Atherton, whose concern is not for justice but for the family's reputation before its maker and its neighbours alike. We have Mrs. Rowan, who I now believe served Clara's own mother in this house 20 years ago, and who has spent the years since in a kind of silent penance, believing silence itself to be a mercy. We have Straker, who holds in his keeping the very documents that could either conceal this history forever or lay it bare beyond recall. And we have young Lyle, who has seen enough of those documents, in the course of his copying, to suspect that some further provision lies hidden within them, a provision he has not been permitted to transcribe. And the bond itself? The bond, Watson, I begin to suspect, was never the true object of the theft, save as it happened to be bound up, quite literally if my reading of Straker's habits is correct, with something of far greater consequence to this family than any sum of money. A sealed memorandum, perhaps, establishing beyond dispute the true nature of Clara Vane's claim upon this house. Consider, Watson, an executor's bond is a dry legal instrument, valuable chiefly as a guarantee that the estate will be lawfully administered. It is not, of itself, a thing that a proud and controlled woman like Lady Honoria would trouble herself to steal from a locked safe at the risk of her own liberty. But a document that determines whether her late husband's daughter by another woman is to be publicly acknowledged as his own, that is a very different matter, and one worth a great deal more than £40 a year to a woman who has built her whole life upon the appearance of an unbroken family name. He rose and stood a moment at the window, looking out toward the chapel that stood a little apart from the house among its old yews. The bond did not merely guarantee money, Watson, he said quietly. I begin to believe it guaranteed legitimacy, and that is a coin no one at Harbury Mere is willing to see paid out, save, perhaps, the one person to whom it rightly belongs. Chapter 7. The Trail of Money. The greenhouse stove at Harbury Mere stood at the farthest end of the kitchen garden, a squat iron contrivance used, I was told, to keep the frost from the more delicate of Lady Honoria's plants through the winter months, and it was there, on the third morning of our stay, that a gardener's boy, raking out the ashes in the ordinary course of his duties, made a discovery that set the whole household by the ears before Holmes and I had so much as finished our breakfast. Inspector Forrester met us at the garden door with a face so bright with satisfaction that I confess I felt some misgiving on my friend's behalf, for Holmes does not care to be forestalled, and there was no mistaking the inspector's air of a man who believes his case complete. "I think we may close the matter today, Mr. Holmes," said he, holding out for our inspection a small twist of paper, in which lay a blackened metal clasp, half melted, and a handful of charred fragments that had once unmistakably formed part of a document, found in the stove not an hour since, along with these. He produced, with something of a flourish, a letter upon cheap paper, addressed to Mr. Reginald Vane, in a clerkish hand, and signed by a money-lender of Curzon Street whose name I recognised, having encountered it before in circumstances that did his reputation no credit. The letter demands payment of some £400 by the end of the month, upon pain of proceedings, Forrester continued, and a housemaid tells me she saw Mr. Reginald crossing the garden toward the greenhouse at 1:45 upon the very night the bond was taken, a good hour after the house was locked, and by a door he has no lawful means of opening save with a key of his own contriving. I think, Mr. Holmes, that we need look no further for our thief. I own that I found the case, thus laid out, very nearly unanswerable, and I said as much to Holmes as we walked back toward the house, the inspector having gone ahead to acquaint Lady Honoria with his triumph. "It has a very complete look, Watson, I grant you," Holmes replied, though without the satisfaction I had expected. A motive established beyond dispute, an opportunity confirmed by an independent witness, and now the very ashes of the crime laid before us like evidence upon a plate. I confess it is almost too complete. You think it a fabrication? I think, Watson, that a guilty man who has just accomplished a theft requiring considerable ingenuity, the manipulation of a household's routine, the lowering of a packet through a high window by a soot-blackened cord, the recovery of that packet before the servants were about their morning work, does not, upon the very night of his triumph, carry the fruits of so much careful labour to the nearest stove, and burn them where a gardener's boy is certain to find the ashes within the week. It is not the conduct of a clever thief, Watson. It is the conduct of a stage villain, burning his stolen letters in the last act for the benefit of an audience. We found Reginald himself in the morning-room, white about the mouth, having plainly just been made acquainted with the discovery, and it was to his credit, I thought, that his first words upon seeing Holmes were not of denial, but of bewilderment. "I never went near the greenhouse that night, Mr. Holmes, I give you my word. I was in my room by 11:30, and if some housemaid says otherwise, she's either mistaken or has been told to say it." "Which housemaid was it, do you know?" "Sarah, the under-housemaid. I have always found her a truthful girl, which makes the matter the more baffling." Holmes asked a few further questions, chiefly as to the exact hour and the state of the moon that night, and then excused himself to seek out the housemaid in question, whom he found, after some searching, engaged in her morning duties in the upper corridor. "You told the inspector you saw Mr. Reginald crossing toward the greenhouse at 1:45, Holmes said to her, in the gentle manner he reserved for witnesses he did not wish to frighten. "Will you tell me how you came to be abroad yourself at such an hour, and how you were able to distinguish his figure so precisely in the dark?" The girl coloured and hesitated, twisting her apron between her fingers. I was told to say it were him, sir, by Mrs. Rowan, who said it would spare a great deal of trouble to the family if the police had someone plain to look at, and Mr. Reginald not liable to come to real harm by it, being family himself, and sure to be let off light. I confess this admission struck me with considerable force, and I saw in Holmes's eye the particular gleam that told me the case had, in that moment, turned a decisive corner. You did not then see him at all? I saw a figure, sir, crossing toward the garden that I'll swear to, but whether it were Mr. Reginald or another, I could not rightly say, the night being overcast and no moon to speak of. Holmes thanked her with a courtesy that plainly surprised her, expecting, I think, some sterner rebuke for her part in the deception, and we withdrew together to the small study that had become our headquarters within the house. "You perceive the shape of it now, Watson," said Holmes, seating himself and regarding the fire with narrowed eyes. "Someone within this household, and I think we need not look far for the someone, has taken considerable pains to fasten suspicion upon Reginald Vane, not from malice, I believe, but from a kind of desperate expedience, as a drowning man will clutch at whatever spar floats nearest, careless of whose raft he sinks in the taking. The burned clasp is old, Watson. Older, I should say, than the dispatch case Straker described to us, for I examined that case myself and found its fittings of a different pattern entirely. The moneylender's letter proves only that Reginald wished to borrow money, which we knew already, and proves nothing whatever as to how he proposed to obtain it. Then who fastened the clasp upon him, and why? That, Watson, is the question upon which the whole of this case now turns, and I begin to believe I know the answer, though I shall want one further proof before I lay it before the household. Greed explains Reginald's debts well enough. It does not explain the fear I've seen in every other face at Harbury Mere, a fear, unless I'm very much mistaken, that has nothing whatever to do with money, and everything to do with the truth that certain persons in this house would sacrifice a great deal, including an innocent man's liberty, to keep from ever being spoken aloud. Chapter 8. The Contradiction in Lady Honoria. I have remarked before, in the course of these narratives, that Holmes possessed a faculty, quite apart from his more celebrated powers of observation, for detecting the false note in a display of feeling, the grief that runs a fraction too smooth, the anger that arrives a moment too late. It was this faculty, more than any physical clue, that occupied him through the whole of that 8th day at Harbury Mere, and it was directed with a persistence I found almost uncomfortable to witness upon the person of Lady Honoria Vane. "Watch her face, Watson, when Miss Clara enters a room," he said to me, as we sat that afternoon in the window of the library, ostensibly absorbed in a volume of the county's history, but in fact observing over its pages the small domestic scene passing before us. "You will not see dislike there, nor even the cold civility one might expect between a lady and a poor relation, whose claims she has some cause to resent. You will see something nearer to pain, Watson, the particular pain of a woman who wishes she might love more freely than her own pride permits her." I looked and saw that he spoke true. Lady Honoria's eyes, resting upon Clara as the girl crossed to the window seat, with some sewing in her hand, held an expression I could only describe as wistful, quickly and deliberately suppressed. "It is the contradiction, Watson, that breaks the false theory entire," Holmes continued. "Consider the matter as the household would have us believe it. If the missing bond, and whatever memorandum was bound up with it, threatens Clara's claim rather than secures it, if its loss delays or defeats her recognition as Sir Edric's daughter, then Lady Honoria, whose whole interest lies in preserving the family name unaltered, ought by rights to feel relief at its disappearance, whoever the thief may prove to be. Instead, I have watched her for 3 days now, and I tell you plainly, Watson, she does not wear the face of a woman relieved. She wears the face of a woman in terror lest the document be found. Not lost, mark you, but found, and found, moreover, by the wrong hands. You believe she fears its recovery more than its loss. I believe, Watson, that she knows precisely where it lies, and has known from the first hour of its disappearance, and that her anxiety these 3 days past has had nothing whatever to do with Reginald, or with Straker, or with the county police, and everything to do with the presence under her own roof of a detective she did not invite and cannot easily send away. It was shortly after this conversation that Holmes announced his intention of examining once more and for the last time, as he put it, the muniment room and its high window, and I accompanied him thither with a curiosity sharpened by 3 days of half-formed conjecture. He mounted as before upon a chair beneath the lattice, but this time he carried with him a length of stout cord and a small horn lantern, and he spent the better part of an hour in an examination so minute that I confess my patience was very nearly exhausted before he descended at last, his face bearing the particular composure of a man who has resolved a difficulty entirely to his own satisfaction. The lattice, Watson, was never forced, as the inspector rightly observed, for it was never intended to be forced. It was opened quite simply, from within, opened by someone standing upon this very chair, some hours before the room was sealed, and left very slightly ajar behind the outer shutter, in a manner that would escape a casual glance, but not, I think, a deliberate search. A weighted cord passed through the gap and down the outer wall to the library window below, which you will recall stands almost directly beneath this one, separated only by the thickness of the recessed chimney breast, would allow a small packet, once the dispatch case had been opened and its contents withdrawn, to be lowered clear of the sealed room entirely, and left to rest within the disused fireplace recess of the library, where no one troubles to look, a chimney having been blocked these 10 years for want of use. And the soot upon the sill? Precisely the soot I found upon my first examination, Watson, transferred from the cord as it passed through the old chimney passage that connects the 2 flues. A passage I confirm this morning still stands open behind the blocked grate, though the fireplace itself has not drawn smoke in a decade. The packet, once lowered, could be retrieved at any hour convenient to its owner, by the simple expedient of reaching into a fireplace no one imagines has been used. And the altered breakfast hour gave our thief the necessary quarter of an hour before the household was about to retrieve the packet from its resting place and dispose of it, or conceal it, beyond any danger of a housemaid's careless dusting. It is, Watson, a very pretty piece of mechanism, and I confess I admire the ingenuity that conceived it, though I cannot admire the purpose to which it has been put. He paused a moment, his hand resting upon the sill, and when he spoke again his voice had lost something of its usual briskness. I have not yet named the culprit to you, Watson, though I think you begin to suspect, as I do, where the truth must lie. I will tell you only this for the present. The person who devised this scheme did not do so to gain an estate, nor even, I believe, to keep one. They did so to prevent a name, a family's name, and perhaps a particular name within that family, from being lowered in the eyes of the world. And I have observed, in the course of a fairly long experience, Watson, that there is very little a proud person will not do, and very little courage they will not summon, in defence of a pride they have mistaken, their whole lives long, for duty. I asked him, as we descended together from that narrow chamber, whether he was now prepared to lay the matter before the household, but he shook his head. Not tonight, Watson. There remains one small proof I have yet to secure, and a wax seal, I think, will furnish it, if I have read its testimony right. Tomorrow, I believe, we shall have the whole truth of Harbury Mere laid bare, and I confess I do not look forward to the telling of it with any great pleasure. Chapter 9. Holmes reveals the truth. The library at Harbury Mere had, by the following evening, taken on something of the character of a courtroom, though no one present would have owned to the resemblance. Holmes had asked that the whole household be assembled after dinner, and they came in by 2s and 3s, with the particular reluctance of people who suspect that the hour of reckoning has arrived and can no longer be postponed by any courtesy of delay. Inspector Forrester stood near the door, his notebook ready. His confidence, I could see, considerably diminished since the morning's interview with the housemaid Sarah. Lady Honoria took her accustomed chair at the head of the room, with a composure that seemed to me now less a natural dignity than a last defence, held together by sheer effort of will. Reginald leaned against the mantel with the sullen wariness of a man who has been accused once already, and does not mean to be taken unawares a second time. Clara sat very still beside Captain Hatherley, her hand, I noticed, resting within his. Mrs. Rowan stood near the door, and Reverend Atherton a little apart from the rest, his face unusually pale. "I have asked you here," Holmes began, "not to prolong an unpleasant business, but to bring it, I hope, to its proper conclusion, and I will begin by clearing away what does not belong to it. Mr. Reginald Vane has been suspected, upon evidence that appeared, upon its first presentation, very nearly conclusive. I must tell you now that every article of that evidence is false." Forrester stirred, but did not interrupt. The scrap of paper found in his room was planted there, by a hand I shall presently name, at a time when his room stood empty, and his door, as is the custom of a young bachelor careless of his own privacy, unlocked. The burned clasp recovered from the greenhouse stove belongs to an older dispatch case than the one Mr. Straker described to me. A case, I am reliably informed, that was retired from use some years ago and has lain since in the muniment room itself, available to anyone with access to that chamber. And the housemaid who claimed to have seen Mr. Reginald crossing to the greenhouse at midnight has confessed to me that she saw only a figure in a night without moon, and was told afterward whose figure it had been by a person she had no cause to doubt. "By whom?" demanded Reginald, straightening from the mantel. "By Mrs. Rowan," said Holmes quietly, "who acted, I believe, not from malice toward you, but from a desperate wish to protect another, and who chose you, I think, because your known debts and your known temper made you a shield that required very little fashioning." Mrs. Rowan's face had gone the colour of ash, but she said nothing, and Holmes, after a moment, continued, "The money-lender's letter proves only what we already knew, that Mr. Reginald wished to borrow money. It proves nothing whatever as to the manner in which he proposed to obtain it, and I think we may set it aside along with the rest." He paused, and I saw his eyes travel, not to Reginald now, but to Lady Honoria, who sat perfectly motionless, her hands folded in her lap. The executor's bond was removed from the sealed muniment room not through the door, which remained locked and truly sealed throughout, but through the high window above the safe, which had been quietly opened earlier in the evening and left ajar behind its shutter. A cord weighted and drawn through the old chimney passage that connects that window to the disused fireplace of this very library, lowered the stolen packet clear of the sealed chamber entirely, to be retrieved at leisure once the household's morning routine had been discreetly rearranged to allow the necessary quarter-hour. "This is ingenious, Mr. Holmes," said Lady Honoria, in a voice that trembled very slightly despite her evident effort to hold it steady. "But ingenuity is not proof." "No, Lady Honoria, it is not," Holmes agreed. "The proof lies elsewhere, and I confess it is a small thing, though small things, as I have had occasion to remark before, have a way of bearing a great weight of truth. The wax seal upon the muniment room door showed, upon my first examination, a flattening at its lower edge, as though some second pressure had been applied after the wax had begun to set, as it would be, for instance, by hand testing with some anxiety, whether the seal still appeared whole after the window above had been used. I took the liberty, yesterday evening, of examining the rings worn by the ladies of this household, and I found upon your own hand, Lady Honoria, a signet whose edge corresponds, in size and in the particular wear of its setting, precisely with the flattened mark upon that seal." There was a long silence, broken at last, not by Lady Honoria, but by Reverend Atherton, who rose from his chair with the air of a man surrendering a burden he could no longer carry alone. "The bond is safe, Mr. Holmes," said he in a low voice. "I have had it these 3 days, hidden behind a loose panel in the chapel vestry. Lady Honoria came to me the morning after it was taken, and begged me, upon what she called the honour of the family, to keep it from discovery until she could determine what was to be done. I did not steal it, sir. I swear before heaven I did not. But I have been these 3 days an accessory to its concealment, and I cannot in conscience remain silent longer." Lady Honoria's composure broke at last. Not into tears, but into a stillness more terrible than weeping, the stillness of a woman who has spent every resource of pride and finds nothing left to spend. "You will have your explanation, Mr. Holmes, since you have earned it," she said. The bond was bound together with a memorandum, drawn up by my husband and witnessed by Straker some years before his death, acknowledging Clara as his daughter by a young woman who once served in this house under an assumed name. Sir Edric intended her to be provided for quietly, without public record, but Straker, in his zeal for lawful order, meant to enter the memorandum into the estate papers as part of the certification, where it must in time become known to the whole county. I could bear the loss of money, Mr. Holmes. I could not bear to see my husband's memory, and this family's name, made the subject of common talk in every drawing-room from here to London. I took the bond, and its memorandum with it, to prevent that talk, not to rob Clara of what is justly hers, whatever you may believe of me." "I believe," said Holmes gravely, "that your motive was the preservation of a name, Lady Honoria, and not the acquisition of a fortune, and I will say, before this company, that the distinction matters a great deal to my own judgment of the case, whatever the law may make of it." Chapter 10. A New Order at Harbury Mere. There was no crude triumph in the days that followed, no publishing of the matter to the county, no spectacle of arrest such as Inspector Forrester's earlier confidence might have led him to expect. I have observed in the course of my association with Holmes that the conclusion of a case is very often quieter than its unravelling, and never was that truth more evident than in the aftermath of that evening in the library at Harbury Mere. Lady Honoria made no further attempt at denial once the memorandum had been produced from its hiding-place in the chapel vestry. She confessed her part with a dignity that I confess moved me more than any protestation of remorse could have done, for there was in her manner none of the theatrical repentance one sometimes encounters in persons caught out in wrongdoing, but only the exhausted honesty of a woman who has spent her whole life governed by appearances and has in a single evening been relieved of the burden of maintaining them. "I do not ask to be forgiven for the theft, Mr. Holmes," she said, when Holmes and I sat with her the following morning in the small sitting-room that had witnessed so much of that week's anxiety. "I ask only that you believe I acted, however wrongly, out of a love for my husband's memory that I did not know how else to express. I have spent 30 years learning to mistake pride for duty, and I do not think I shall unlearn the habit easily even now." Mrs. Rowan, for her part, confessed her own share in the business with considerably less composure, weeping as she told us that she had served Clara's mother in this very house 20 years before, and had watched, with a servant's helpless loyalty, as that young woman was sent quietly away with a settlement that could never repay what she had lost. "I thought I was protecting the child from shame, sir, in helping her ladyship as I did," she told Holmes, "though I see now I was protecting a lie, and not the child at all." Holmes insisted, and I thought him entirely right to insist, that the law must be satisfied so far as its proper claims extended, but he urged upon Lady Honoria, and upon Inspector Forrester besides, a considerable measure of discretion where justice allowed it, and I was glad to see that his counsel was followed. The executor's bond was restored to its rightful place in the certification of the estate, and Clara's provision, secured at last by the very memorandum that had so nearly been destroyed to keep it hidden, was settled in a manner that established her rights beyond any future question, while sparing the family the full glare of public scandal that Lady Honoria had feared above all else. Reginald Vane, cleared at last of a suspicion that had rested upon him through no fault of his own, bore the experience, I thought, with more grace than I had expected of him. "I own I am humbled by it, Doctor," he told me, as we walked together in the grounds upon the last morning of our stay. "It is a sobering thing to discover how easily a man's known faults can be made to stand as proof of a crime he never committed. I do not think I shall spend so carelessly again, whatever my expectations from the estate." Captain Hatherley, I was glad to observe, had stood by Clara throughout the whole distressing business without once wavering, and it was plain, from the manner in which she now looked upon him, that whatever doubts his earlier caution might have raised in her mind had been entirely dispelled by his conduct through the ordeal. I told you, Doctor, that my concern was never for her worth, but for her protection, he said to me, with the particular satisfaction of a man whose judgment has been vindicated. I am glad the world may now know what I have known from the first, that she has nothing whatever to be ashamed of, and a great deal to be proud of. Reverend Atherton resigned of his own accord the private authority he had long exercised over the family's conscience, confessing to Holmes before we left that he had come to see how easily the wish to spare pain could curdle into something nearer to complicity. I don't know that the county lost a great deal by his more modest conduct thereafter, though I believe Harbury Mere gained something in its place. As for the house itself, I could not but observe, in the short remainder of our visit, that its old hierarchy, while not overthrown, had been quietly and permanently redefined. Clara Vane was no longer the dependent shadow who had crossed the drawing-room with such uncertain steps upon our first evening there. She moved now with the settled assurance of a woman whose place in the world had ceased to be a matter of anyone's charity. Lady Honoria remained, and I think will long remain, the mistress of Harbury Mere, but she had ceased, I thought, to be its unquestioned moral judge, and there was in the altered manner of the household toward her something that resembled respect a good deal more honestly than the old deference had ever done. We took our leave the following afternoon, and it was upon the train homeward, as the grey towers of Harbury Mere sank at last behind the autumn trees, that Holmes offered the reflection with which I choose to close this account. You will observe, Watson, that I did not solve this case by asking who wanted money, though money's shadow lay across every interview I conducted there. I solved it by asking instead who feared truth, for greed, Watson, is a simple appetite, and wears its motive openly enough once a man's debts are known. But the fear of disgrace is a subtler thing, and will drive a proud woman to action she would never contemplate for gain, and drive an honest clergyman to conceal what his conscience must in time have compelled him to confess unaided. He was silent a moment, watching the darkening fields pass beyond the window. The bond was never taken for profit, Watson. It was taken to preserve a fiction, the fiction that a family's honour depends upon the silence of its history rather than the truth of it. And I have found, in a fairly long experience of such matters, that an order built upon concealment is no order at all, but only a debt deferred, gathering interest against the day when someone braver, or simply less fortunate than the rest, is obliged to pay it. I have set down this account, as I have set down others, in the hope that it may serve as some small record of my friend's singular powers, exercised as they so often were, not merely in the detection of crime, but in the patient and compassionate unravelling of the human frailty that lies, more often than the casual observer supposes, at crime's very root,